Good afternoon, folks. We're going to get started. The stragglers come in when they will. As we're winding this down, we have some pretty interesting stuff to yet bring to the table. We're going to be hearing from John McArthur in just a moment, who's going to be followed by Elizabeth. And then we're going to close with just an open discussion about what your takeaways are, where you think we need to head. I've been working on identifying the core themes or threads that have been running through the program, and it will be your time. So, without wasting any more time, I'll turn it over to John. I've already asked John you have his title, you have his bio, but I asked him to spend some time introducing himself.
Thank you so much. Oh, we have a webcast, awesome. Does this work naturally? Okay, great. Ooh, even better. Oh, there we go. Okay, even better. Since we're small and intimate. Work? Yes. Okay. So my name's John McArthur. Hi, Lisa. And I am given the gift of speaking to you guys after 2 very intense days between now and the weekend or a trip home. So I thank the hosts, but in all seriousness, originally I was asked to come here yesterday, but I was in Canada for some related discussions, and actually it was quite cogent because I'm an economist by training, I would say a generalist by vocation. I was very involved with the launch of the Millennium Development Goals global policy process under the previous Secretary General, and I'm a bit of a hybrid of sorts. So my academic friends think I'm an activist, and my activist friends think I'm an academic, and somewhere between the two is true. And so I have had the privilege to work with some of you and people around the world across disciplines, ranging from health to agriculture to gender equality to water and sanitation, climate, and so forth. And I was very involved with what I would call the wholesale debates around the Sustainable Development Goals, but not so much the retail politics day to day. I left to the pros this time. But I thought it would be maybe interesting just to start by asking you a question, because you are all approaching this from your own perspectives. And I'd like to ask you just to grab the person next to you, and maybe we can even join in here so that we're all in the same conversation, but just to sit next to someone. And I'd like you to just grab the person next to you, so maybe even in the back we can consolidate. And I'd like you to just give your gut answer to a very simple question. Even though I know this is an incredibly intellectually rigorous group, I'd love to know your gut answer to the following question, just to take 15 seconds to share it with your partner. As an experiment, what do you think are the 2 most important issues the world needs to solve today? What are the 2? Just from your gut. Don't think too hard. What's your gut answer to that question? Just take 15 seconds with the person next to you. Okay, has everyone had a chance to mention 2? All right, I'd love to just bring it back then. And again, this is just a gut check. So I'm curious if we can have some courageous volunteers. What came up? What did you guys come up with your partners? Violence, poverty. So we're gonna go 2 at a time, or if you can have 4. If you had two. So violence and poverty, I heard. Homicide, I'm going to include that in violence. Okay. What else? Any others? Nuclear disarmament. It's a pretty big. Injustice. Education.
Climate change.
Unemployment. Okay.
And the
Gender equality. Yep.
all of the inequities that
Inequality writ large.
divides.
Okay. Anything that hasn't been mentioned yet? Epidemic. Health and disease. Okay. Health, epidemic, pandemic. Okay. Please. Okay. Kind of human resilience. Is that a fair paraphrase? Okay. Water. Anything come up that hasn't been mentioned yet? Okay, so just to summarize, we have violence, poverty, nuclear disarmament, injustice, education, climate, youth unemployment, gender equality, general inequality, healthy living, I would say kind of human resilience, and water. All right. So it's interesting cross-section. So now I have another question for you. How is it that when I only asked you to give the top 2 goals, you guys, or top 2 things, you guys came up with 12? You're a smart group. But I only asked you for the top 2. We all have different perspectives. We all see the world through different challenges and through a different lens. Now, my next question is, which ones of you are right and which ones of you are wrong? So who is wrong on that list? Which one of these should we cut? Water over nuclear weapons, or poverty or violence or education or climate or youth unemployment? Which one of those would you cut?
Well, I say don't have anything else to worry about it. Destroy our planet. And nothing else, anything else in that list.
And if we don't have nuclear war? Because you get two, remember?
Well, I say climate change.
So here's what I want to suggest. You guys have just listed actually 11 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And what you just spent 1 minute on, 3 minutes we can say, the world spent 3 years on. And it was the most inclusive global agenda setting process the world has ever seen. And more than 8 million people involved, depending on how you count. And that's pretty extraordinary. It's the most, we've never had anything like that. And the world came up with these 17 goals. Now, I go through this little exercise because I think we're not used to thinking about how to think about an agenda like this. One of the names that's used for this agenda is Agenda 2030, or the 2030 Agenda, because these are all goals, roughly speaking, for 2030. I actually don't think that's quite right. I think this is the 2030 agenda of agendas. There are many agendas embedded in this. This is a complex set of issues for what is ultimately a very complex world. And having been involved with the early days of the Millennium Development Goals, where most people would say it's a terrible idea, it's never going to work, here's what's wrong with it, here's what you've left out. And the first 5 years were, no one even knew how to articulate them for the first 2 years, then it took 3 years to get people to take them seriously, and then it took a kind of few special moments to get the politics off the ground. And then everyone started to take them for granted. Well, of course we believe in this. And you saw this cascade effect where first we start with, especially in the health sector, HIV/AIDS, which was considered impossible. And then we started to scale up AIDS treatment. And then, okay, well, if we can do AIDS, we should be able to do malaria because that's totally treatable. And then wait a sec, well, we have this goal 4 on child survival and this goal 6 on infectious disease. How come we keep forgetting goal 5, maternal health? And you saw these cascades of what I would call epistemic communities self-organizing to learning by doing. And that matters because we have a lot of learning by doing to do for these goals. Now, quick story, if I may, is these goals were actually, after a few years of negotiation, were formalized, final agreement, on Sunday, August the 2nd, 2015. I happen to know because I looked it up after. And that night, I was in Washington, actually, but my friends had all been in the negotiations. They hadn't slept for days. They come down. It's a very emotional moment for many people who have been involved in this, because years of discussion. And I called my mother that night. My retired mother, 70-something-year-old, back in Vancouver, where I grew up. My mom's a wonderful person, very supportive of me, doesn't totally understand what I do for a living, but always very supportive. And I said, Mom, you know those goals, end of extreme poverty and all that, which is really the kind of first among equals of these goals, end of extreme poverty. I said, the world agreed to do that today by 2030. I said, oh, that's exciting. I said, yeah, it is. And I said, there's only one problem. She said, what's that? And I was thinking I had to give 3 speeches in the following 10 days. And I said, these goals, there's 17 of them. I don't know how to explain them. She said, 17, that's a great number. Caught me by surprise. I was like, well, you're the first person to say that. Okay, Mom, why is 17 a great number? Being kind of surly child in that moment. And she said, well, it's complicated. Sounds like they didn't fake it. And then afterwards she added, if they'd come back with some Letterman-style top 10, I probably wouldn't have believed them. It's good insight, Mom. But so then 10 days later, I was in Geneva at the World Economic Forum, a bunch of social entrepreneurs, business, government, people from around the world, a few hundred, my closest friends. Get up there, I had to explain these goals. I showed the graphs, this is going well, it's going badly. And I just thought I ad-libbed this comment of my mother's. The world's complicated. And for the next 3 days, everyone comes up to me and says, it's like your mom said. The world's complicated. I love these goals. And it was a really profound insight for me, because we're so used to trying to simplify, I included, try to simplify how to boil things down. But one of the things I've noticed in the discussion around these goals is that people already know the world is complicated. So what we're doing here is putting words to a feeling they already have. And we're actually putting a bunch of targets around it. And I think that matters, because as we think about how to implement these goals, to move from the summits to the solutions, which is the key point, obviously, we have to think about how to respect the complexity that is the world and that people already feel. And I think there's no issue in which that is more pertinent than the one you guys have been talking about for the past 2 days of confronting violence. This is, in my view, as a kind of a generalist on policy issues, very complex. And I don't pretend to understand what to do about it. But I know that you guys are the ones that I'm going to turn to learn in order so that we can figure out what to do about it. So it's like the humility that respects the complexity in order to get the simple success, if that paradox makes sense. So that said, I want to just share a couple of headline stories, though, of where we are and where we're going. So in my view, the number one success of the Millennium Development Goals is, without question, the stories of life and death around the global health revolution. This, many of you were in your own capacities involved with parts of this. This is just the ongoing acceleration of reductions in child mortality. And so the top line is if it had gone as if the 1990s just kept going. The middle line is if the turn of the millennium kept going. And then the dark line is what actually happened. And the difference between just the bottom 2 lines is at least 8.8 million children's lives. It's up to 20 million if you add up all the different sides. It's a lot of lives. Extreme poverty has been coming down dramatically. It's this so-called $1 a day. The technical measurement of this is imprecise. There's a lot of refinement going on. It's not to overinterpret any single numbers. But it's coming down dramatically, except the fragile states. I'm guessing this has come up here. But the fragile states of the world, this green line, have not been coming down at the same pace. And this is part of the so-called last mile of extreme poverty. We're on track currently to get to, on a business as usual trajectory, 4% of the world living in extreme poverty by 2030. By any notion of the history of civilization, it's mind-blowing progress. The only problem is that that means, even if, say it were 5%, that would be 400 million people. If it doesn't go quite that fast, it's still a lot of people. But we're getting to zero across the board. This is, if we go on business as usual, access to safe drinking water. My colleague Krista in the back and I have been just doing some basic arithmetic on this. And we're getting pretty close on a business as usual trajectory to everyone in the world having drinking water. But the world has changed dramatically. So the world of 2000, when these MDGs were launched, is not the world of 2016. And it's certainly not the world of 2020 or 2025 or 2030. So this is just economic growth by initial income group. By the low income is the dark blue, the middle income is the green, and the light blue is the high income. Now, why is this important? Economic growth is a shorthand for change. It's the change in the world economy. And if you had taken this graph back, really a couple hundred years to the Industrial Revolution, it was a handful of countries, the light blue. It was Western Europe, United States, the so-called European offshoots, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. They were driving the world economy. They were the engine room of the global growth. But in the past 15 years, and in 2000, $7 out of every $10 of global economic change every year was coming from those rich countries. Really, the G7 was the heart of it. In the past 15 years, that's flipped. The majority of the change in the world economy, economic activity, is now driven by the so-called developing countries. I am of the view that even the word developing country is becoming obsolete. It's no longer a helpful term, given what we're trying to understand. The notion of moving from, as my colleague McArthur said, from a developing country to a developing world, because the issues are increasingly common across countries. Now, the flip side of the economic gains is that each new unit of economic progress is churning out one new unit of, in particular, environmental challenge. It's a duality we have to get our head around and fix. So this is CO2 emissions at Mauna Loa Observatory. As of early last year, we're now reliably above 400 parts per million. That's the worst we've been in several million years. Kind of a bad data point. But it's a product of our success. Because the economic progress of the world is what's churning this out. And that has to be understood as to why it's so hard for so many economies to have the type of conversation other parts of the world might want to have around how to fix it. We can get into this, and I have thoughts on how to fix it, but we have to understand it's not just a problem that came out of nowhere. It's a problem that is linked to the success. It's the flip side of success, and that's complexity. Of course, we have things like highly interconnected global society now. This is from the Ebola crisis. We now know that any clinic in the world is a source of potential risk or solution for every person in the world, wherever it might be. And these issues of violence, this is Syrian refugees, can land on any shore in the world in very short notice in ways that no one expected. In ways that actually our international system is nowhere near wired to address. That's why there's literally millions of people with nowhere to go right now, because we actually aren't wired to address this. So bottom line, it's complicated. It's complex. What does that mean? That means we need new mindsets, we need new institutions, we need new ways of working together. I am of the view of thinking about this as a matrixed approach to the world. We have some legacy institutions over here, the original post-World War II Bretton Woods, IMF, World Bank. We have new ones coming up, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, kind of a rejection of the old, a launch of the new. We have the kind of modern institutions like the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, Malaria, Gavi, Global Vaccine Alliance. These are kind of public-private scientific partnerships with governments playing a role but not having the final say. And then we have all sorts of things like academic collaboration around the world. We have private sector cooperation around the world. Anyone can, I think it was when the UN was launched, it was $50, pardon me, for a 3-minute phone call from New York to London. So you needed intermediaries in order to cooperate because it was just so darn expensive. Now, of course, that call is free on a Skype or anything else. We don't need as many intermediaries. That means more people can connect. That means more people will connect. That means there's more to manage. So how does one think about this moving forward? How does one boil this down? Because, nice to say the world's complicated, but you still got to do something. You still got to think of something. So you have to have a framework. So we did a project called Ending Rural Hunger. We spent a couple of years looking at the data around the world. We said, let's at least take just one goal, we call half of one goal, hunger. There's a goal to end hunger by 2030. We said, let's look at the rural component, because rural is separate from urban, the causes and consequences. And we, for just this issue, looked at well over 100 variables to index them to say, how can we assess how each country's doing and what's needed and how an international partner could help and how a local partner could help, and how do you prioritize efforts? And it all boils down to this little triangle. And in the course of doing it, Homi and I and Krista and our colleagues who were looking at this say, this could apply to any goal, this simple triangle. What are the needs? What are the policies? And what are the resources? And how does that help us prioritize? So just to think through the implication, the worst case is to spend all our time worried about places with low needs, terrible policies, and tons of resources. It's just not a great place to spend your time. The best case is to spend your time in a place with very high needs, amazing policies, and not much resources, broadly defined. Because you'll get a lot of bang for your buck. Resources you can define very broadly. You can define it in terms of your time. You can define it in terms of dollars, lots of ways. But life, of course, is in between, most of life. But if you think about it in across these 3 dimensions, you can then have an honest conversation with whoever you're dealing with. Well, let's understand what the needs are in this case. What's the problem we're trying to solve? Let's understand these things are affected by policy. We're not going to attract more resources unless the policies are clear. Whether it's the local government, the international actor, but as much as some issues are independent of money, a lot of issues need resources. Human, organizational, technological, financial. And let's not shy away from the issues of where resources are needed and what for. And so that is how I would suggest one might start thinking about these goals, which ultimately I would boil down to, as we pivot from the Millennium Development Goal era to the Sustainable Development Goal era, I call it the big set of second halves. First, it's the second half of extreme poverty. The Millennium Goals are about cutting extreme poverty by half in many forms, roughly speaking. So it's the second half. It's the getting to zero agenda. That's crucial. I think it's the #1 litmus test of everything we do, but it's not the only one, because it's the second half of the issues. The Millennium Goals didn't address explicitly peace and justice and strong institutions, didn't address explicitly violence against women, didn't address oceans, just happened to cover 70% of the planet, kind of a big issue, didn't address jobs, youth. It actually did address youth unemployment, but no one really picked it up to run with it, didn't elevate it, didn't address clean energy and climate. And I haven't heard anyone argue that you can solve the world's problems without addressing any of those issues. So second half of the issues, but third, it's the second half of the world. So it used to be about developing countries. It was a kind of an over-there conversation in the advanced economies. But now it's an everywhere conversation. It's about all of us. These issues apply to every community in the world in some form. They're common issues with different manifestations. But the final thing, and this is where I'll conclude, the final thing is I think it's about the second half of society. So the Millennium Goals, roughly speaking, and fairly or unfairly, were perceived as an issue of government and NGOs. These issues cannot be addressed, whether it's climate, whether it's inequality, whether it's hunger, whether it's poverty, without addressing, also including the business community. Clean energy is not a pure government challenge. It needs Elon Musk just as much as it needs the Department of Energy, right? Times a million. But it also needs the scientific community. And one of the things that's so interesting, and we did a study of even discussions of the Millennium Development Goals in academic journals. The journal that discussed the Millennium Development Goals more than any other was The Lancet. And that's part of how the epistemic community learned and debated and researched. The American Economic Review did not. The Journal of Development Economics had its first reference to the Millennium Development Goals in 2007, and then only, I think, a dozen in the several years since. Journal of Comparative Education Review, is it? Had a handful, but not a deep debate on this, which I think is part of why the education community maybe stalled midway through the Millennium Development Goals. It wasn't having the idea debates to fuel the next wave of breakthroughs. And I stress that because what you're doing today, and it's why I jumped to be here when I was invited, because I deeply believe the policy debates are won through the debates on ideas and the debates on evidence and the debates on how the evidence and the ideas interface with practice. And so the community that's represented here is in many ways the engine room of fueling those debates. And this is how I think we can approach these goals as a universal agenda, but really as a deep understanding of an agenda of agendas that each of you can contribute to through your various pieces of evidence, practice, and policy. So thank you very much.
We're going to hold off on questions, allow Elizabeth to present, then we're going to open the floor to questions to both John and Elizabeth.